welcome back to this is the second part of my conversation with Kit Gruelle. My name is Goulden. I've got Kit who, listen, go and tell us where you are just now, Kit. You live in a lovely part of America. Tell us where you are.
I'll turn the cameras, my phone so you can see, maybe you can see it. Can you see that?
Yeah, oh yeah. Is it the Blue Mountains? Is that what you call it?
Yes, the Blue Ridge Mountains.
So
that's my valley. That's where I live, and it's spectacular. But in some parts of it, there's not a great signal. So I'm up here on this kind of overlook, and
yeah.
But I love it here.
It's lovely. I follow you on Facebook. We speak to some of the pictures from your log cabin, and I just want to come out and see it. It looks a wonderful place to stay. I need to do that. We need to meet up. But listen, in that, thank you for coming back. In that last conversation, we really started to look at the work that you do. We started to touch on that film Private Violence, which is available, and it's available online, and you can get hold of the DVD if you search for it online.
And it's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's on Amazon for people to purchase it. It's an American movie, but it really puts the audience in the shoes of not only the advocate but also the victim. I found that a really powerful experience. And in that last conversation we had, we really looked at the impact of domestic abuse in society. I mentioned about the launch of the Youth Violence Commission. My view is that there will never be peace in the streets until we have peace in the home. Peace in the world, we have peace in the home. And that's why I think the violence reduction units across the UK and people who are listening and involved in law enforcement, involved in a whole range of issues, need to really start looking at how they respond to domestic abuse in society, because I think we can make a massive difference to levels of other forms of violence, homicides, knife carrying, all these issues, which I think the backstory is often domestic abuse in the family. I want to start to think about some solutions to some of these issues, and we've talked about responses from the police, responses from domestic abuse advocates. I want to start looking quite closer to home in society. In that last conversation, you talked about victim blaming. Victim blaming for me is one of the barriers to prevention. For me, it's a barrier to prevention, because when we focus our conversations on the actions of the victim, we miss the conversation that needs to be having around why did the perpetrator do what they did. Right. You talked about that question that is often asked: why doesn't she just leave? Why do you think that's a bad thing?
I just still think that we uniquely, with crimes committed against women and against children, rather than put the responsibility and the onus on the offender to change his behavior, which, by the way, is a choice. It's like one of the examples I use when I go to train is when we say you live in a community and there's a bank in the community and the bank gets robbed 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Police come out and they dust for fingerprints, they interview all the witnesses, and then on the third or the fourth robbery, at the end of the investigation, they don't go to the bank president and say, well, you need to move this bank now. You've been here a long time. People know there's money here. Of course they're going to show up. You must like getting robbed. Yeah. But for some reason, when a woman is assaulted sexually or physically, we just automatically say, well, what'd you do to make him mad? And what I think we have to think about as a society when we do this is we're essentially driving the getaway car for the abuser. And the more we look the other way at his choice to be abusive and his choice to be controlling and aggressive, we shouldn't be surprised when it just gets worse. So that's my kind of big takeaway right now is we have to quit empowering abusers to just take it to the next level. We have to quit allowing ourselves to be manipulated about it. I mean, with all the training that I do with law enforcement, I tend to ask them when I'm doing training is, what's your typical domestic violence call like? Well, of course, there's not exactly a typical domestic violence call, but for the most part, when they show up, the abuser immediately tries to cozy up with the officer. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason that he's going to be cooperative. There's a reason that he's going to be yes sir, no sir. Because when the case goes to court, And the officer takes the witness stand, and the defense attorney says, "How was my client when you showed up?" And the officer, speaking honestly, is going to say, "Well, he was very cooperative." But then if she's hysterical and crying, then all that does is hem her in that much more. So I think we have to understand the manipulative tactics that abusers oftentimes use. And there's a scene in the film that illuminates it, where the suspect who's in custody, and the judge is talking with him about the terms and conditions of the restraining order, and he yes sir, no sirs with the judge. But then when he turns to go out, he stops just for a nanosecond and turns back and shoots a look at the victim, and that look says, "I'm going to kill you." Yeah. And it's so powerful because nobody else in the courtroom saw it. I mean, on the day that we were in court, we happened to have 2 cameras rather than just one. And Cynthia very wisely said, keep a camera on this suspect. And so when he shot that look back at her, and you can see her just kind of shrink and shrivel up. And when I've shown the film amongst a bunch of advocates, particularly advocates who go to court, there's always an audible gasp because they've seen that so much. And so again, it goes back to what we talked about in the earlier segment, where there's multiple tactics that abusers use, and we as first responders, we as a society have to be mindful of those multiple tactics and how effective they can be. We have to be mindful of the coded language that abusers and victims have. Things like the hand towel that I talked about before. If we get smarter, and if we, as a society, say, no, he is making a choice to control, abuse, terrorize, coerce, intimidate, harass his wife and kids, or his girlfriend and kids, and that's an assault against all of us, then I think we can start to make some progress.
Yeah, you talk about these signs of domestic abuse, coercive control, and often they are invisible in plain sight. I think the Canadian Evan Stark uses that phrase, invisible in plain sight. And once you start to learn about what they look like, not only the signs but the tactics of the abuser, you can't unsee that. It becomes clear. It becomes, yeah, that's so obvious. So that's something which I really want people to start to think about, is read up on this, do the knowledge on this stuff, learn about. There's a UK-based expert, Laura Richards, who talks about coercive control. Really knowledgeable, easy to read information that can be shared. And yeah, you're right. Victim blaming. It's what Dr. Jess Taylor talks about. She talks about victim blaming in the UK. And she calls that behavioural victim blaming. The behaviour of the victim is used to blame the victim. And my friend, I think, Jackson Katz in America as well, he says that when you focus on the victim, the abuser's behaviour is not being inspected, by society.
Well, we really have to understand, and it's been useful for me over the years to spend as much time with law enforcement as I do, to start to orient myself towards tactical behavior. That there's a goal, and the goal is to first gain and then to maintain the control over the victim. So there's grooming behavior that goes on early on. Virtually every woman that I have worked with, the 36 to 40,000 women that I have worked with, has said to me at some point in time during the interaction, when I first met him, he was the nicest guy I ever met. And when we get to the place where the victim can safely look back at that, and then see how that dynamic started to change, and how he started to assert control over her by saying very subtle things like, well, I wanted us to spend the whole weekend together, so maybe don't go to your parents. And women are socialized to be compliant. We're socialized to be understanding, to be forgiving. I call it kind of the empath and the sociopath dynamic. It's like empaths and sociopaths don't belong anywhere near each other. Like my ex probably could have been diagnosed as a sociopath, and I am very. It's just how I'm wired, and it just was a really bad combination. So when I work with law enforcement and we have this discussion around tactical behavior of abusers, and we say things like, well, think about the last time there was a murder-suicide in your community, and the television station sends out a reporter, and the reporter finds the neighbor almost invariably says, but he seemed like the nicest guy. So that's an example of what we're talking about when we say this is tactical behavior. If he walks out the door and he's the nicest guy, but then inside he's the exact opposite, then he's choosing when and how to exert his abuse and his coercive behavior.
I think, a story I give often is, I do a lot of trainings, and I often hang back at the end of my training because people come up to me and they'll thank me for the training, or they might talk about an experience they've had. And one day, this man came up to me and he said, have you got 2 minutes to chat? I said, yeah, I'm here to talk. And he talked about how a friend of his wife was being very badly controlled, coercively controlled, horrible things going on. And he just didn't, it was his best friend that was the perpetrator, and he just didn't know what to do. And I said, well, your wife is doing the right thing. She's making the connection with your friend's wife, partner, saying the good things. I gave him some tips around what sort of things she could be saying. And I asked him the question, your friend, you've got to be careful speaking to your friend about this, because you don't want to put the victim at any more risk. But tell me about him in other circumstances. And it just clicked. He was quite manipulative and controlling with other people as well. And I'm not saying that every controlling friend is a domestic abuser, but it's these subtle things that can be brought alongside each other to really build that picture, and can be used by the police for evidence. We can, in Scotland and in the UK, we have a coercive control law, where I think in Scotland it relates to controlling and abusive behaviour. So if we have evidence of controlling, and it could be any form of control, and we can build the case, we can actually prosecute a person for domestic abuse now. It doesn't have to be the assault or the stalking. It's a domestic abuse crime, and I think that's something that we can all. I think we all need to be more aware of in the UK, is that it's not just the punch or the kick or the sexual violence that constitutes domestic abuse, controlling behaviour as well, because we recognise the impact of coercive control on the victim, the terror that is in that person's life. And what's the most powerful thing that any one of us could, if a friend discloses they have been a victim of domestic abuse? You've talked about help by listening, so that's one thing I want to get across to people. Listen to people. But what's the most, I like to give people a couple of sentences, a couple of tools in the back pocket that they can just bring out in those first 2 minutes. What's the most powerful thing that anybody could say to a victim of domestic abuse?
That it's not her fault.
Yeah.
That no matter what anybody says, it's not her fault. Help her understand that he's making a choice, that he doesn't have to choose to be controlling and coercive and abusive, and that you're going to keep the door open for them. Yeah. Because people get, when they don't understand the proverbial cycle where, he's abusive and controlling, and then he follows it up with being gentle and kind again for a brief period of time. They have to understand that violence against women, violence against children is context heavy. And when they understand that they can play a very important part, they might be the first and only person who listens to this victim and validates her experience and says to her, I'm sorry that you're going through this. You don't deserve to be treated like this. I know that it's complicated, but I want you to know that I'm going to be here for you no matter what. And when she feels like she's not alone and that she's not going to be judged, that's when the baby steps start to happen. And then if that friend or that neighbor or whatever starts to find out what the local resources are and says to her, let me help you get connected to those resources. You can come here and use the phone if you need to. It really is, we want to think that it's the grand gestures, but oftentimes it's the small things.
Yeah.
After a long period of time of feeling invalid as a human being, now she's feeling a sense of validation.
Yeah. I think we know that victims of crime, domestic abuse, blame themselves. It's in society, it's in the air, so they just suck that blame in and they blame themselves. And then we do it as well by asking questions like, why don't you just leave? And it's right. Maybe there's no harm meant there by the person, but let's just get across to that. It's probably one of the worst things that we can say to a victim, a domestic abuse victim. And you're right, Kit, I tell people, in the first few sentences, that wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve that. And I think when you start to, I think that the job of a friend, the job of a work colleague or whoever, the perpetrator sucks the power away from the victim. Right?
If she
Our
hadn't
job is
to begin with, I think it's important for us to remember, again, and this is why I think these cases are so context heavy. A lot of domestic abuse victims are very strong and independent women, and for some abusers, they will look at a strong independent woman and think, I'm going to take her down. I'm going to get her to where she under my thumb, like the Rolling Stones song. And but then there are some women who, again, like I said earlier on, have cut their teeth on this bad power dynamic, and that's just what they're comfortable in. I mean, I know for myself, after Jack died, and luckily, several years later, I got into therapy, and I had to look not only at the power dynamic with him, but the power dynamic between my parents and what I had grown up thinking was normal. And it's still a process for me. I'm not going to sit here and say that I've got it all worked out, because I don't. But my antenna is up now for a bad power dynamic in any relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship, a parent-child relationship, because when there is a dynamic where one person is saying, I have power and authority over you, then the person who that power and authority is being exercised on is diminished as a person. And life is just different for them.
Yeah, it really helps. It just helps understand, victimization. What else is needed to respond to domestic abuse in society? Let's just end with that. In this world, what else do we need to be doing?
We've just got to see women as valuable human beings. I mean, it just kind of blows my mind that we're still at this place where we diminish the significance of violence and abuse and coercion perpetrated on and against women, as if women are still 10th class status people. And I just don't know what it's going to take for society to understand that we want to be, all we ask to be treated as is equals. Why is that such a stretch? And the other thing too that I want to say, because we haven't talked about this, is when we hold out power as the thing that men feel entitled to or should want to attain, and that they will do almost anything to attain it, I think what we need to say to men is, look what you're losing in the process. Yeah. You may wind up with a lot of personal power, but who have you hurt along the way? And that we need to say that fear and respect are not the same thing. And if we can raise our male children to understand that that having control over someone does not indicate how powerful they are as people, then maybe we'll start to be in a better place as a society.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to really start to bring this conclusion. And I've got a real passion for working with boys and men and engaging people who work with boys and men to have these types of conversations. Fathers are the role models for their sons. Youth workers, sports coaches are the role models. They're not just the role models, they're the guideposts for boys. They're the guideposts for their daughters as well, on how, right. You've talked about some trauma, and for me as a father, I'm the guidepost for my daughters on how I treat women, with respect and with dignity and with being equal. So it's really it's a powerful thing. We know, and we focused a lot on men's violence against women in these conversations, and we know in society that men are victims of domestic abuse, and that's another conversation that we could have. And I'm glad we've maintained that focus on men's violence against women, because that for me is the issue that I see. It doesn't mean we ignore male victims. It doesn't mean we don't care about male, but I care about all victims of crime. They deserve to be treated with compassion, validate their experiences. But this conversation, I wanted to take it down the line that you're passionate about, your expertise is in, and I really enjoyed this conversation, Kit. You've helped me over the last, and I'm really starting to speak to some people now online to record some conversations of people that my heroes in the world, people who've helped me along my path and my understanding, and really filled my head with some really good information. And my job now is to fill other people's heads with information as well that you've taught me. It's like passing the trophy down the sort of legacy. You know, you're part of the your legacy is that you're empowering other people to talk about these issues. So, listen, can I thank you for taking your time today? I'm glad we had the chance to see the Blue Mountains of West of you know,
North Carolina.
Virginia. It's brilliant to see that because I see the pictures online. And yeah, thank you for taking the time today to open up and be honest about your experiences, what you do, why you do what you do. You know, I think we'd agree that let's shout out to all victims of domestic abuse here. It's not your fault. You know, there are excellent resources out there that you can get help from. In this country, we have Women's Aid, Scottish Women's Aid, right, crisis centres around the country who are open. Even during COVID-19, they're open for business. And we need to make sure that organisations, people know these organisations are there. You know, for male victims in Scotland, we have the Abused Men in Scotland website as well. So there's great organisations out there with people who will listen, help by listening. That's a really good bit of advice for everybody here. When you suspect a friend maybe a victim of domestic abuse, or they tell you, just lean into the issue. Don't walk away from it. Don't say, oh, but it'll be okay. Lean into the issue. Have that courage. This is leadership, people. Lean into the issue, ask the question, and acknowledge. You know, help by listening, and then validate that person's experience. So, Kit, listen. Right. Thank you for your time today. It's been great.
Thanks, Graham. It's great to see you.
And thank you for my POV for hosting this session today.